Thanks for being here, everybody. So as mentioned, my name's Gary. So yeah, I've been working at the IRB now for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years or something like that, and was also part of research education in the pediatrics department for a few years. I got my education at the University of Utah, a bachelor's in sociology, and went on to get a master's in public administration. So I'm definitely familiar with being a student and also a administrator that I act in now. So I'm glad you guys are here. This program's awesome. And I think I'll just say up front, I'll go through a lot of what an IRB is, an institutional review board, and how it relates to human subjects research. And hopefully at some point down the road, if you haven't already, this will be something that's just in the back of your mind. So when you do interact with the IRB or have a research project, you know where to go. So there's a lot of information here that might not be directly applicable right now, but hopefully at some point it will be. And so just know that we're here to help going forward. So as mentioned, you've probably heard of an IRB, and maybe you haven't, an institutional review board, but just to give you an idea, the main idea of an institutional review board is to protect human subjects in research. So any research that has to do, with humans. So we'll go through a little bit about that. Let me see. Let's switch this slide here. So really, the objectives are threefold. First, I'm just gonna go over kind of a review of the historical foundation of why we have human subjects research protections. So be forewarned, it gets a little sad at the start here because we're talking about the reason why we have boards to review ethics. So we'll talk about the historical foundation, which I think is good to know, to help make the IRB feel less like a red tape to your research and more like an actual ethics board. And then understanding your specific IRB, and by that I mean the University of Utah IRB, like what do IRBs do, and then how does it apply to your research here at the U of U that you may have done already or will do in the future. And then kind of tied into that is I just want to show you the resources that we have. There's a ton of resources at the U of U for research in general and how to navigate the IRB. So will kind of end on that. And I should also say, please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to jump in at any time. So the outline, again, we'll go historical foundation, then I'll talk about basically what an IRB is, the mission and composition, what it takes for a study to get approved by the IRB, and then the resources. So we'll jump right into the historical foundation. So this slide is kind of like a timeline, if you will. And at the top kind of is some key, I guess you would call them, I don't know, some of them are laws, some of them are codes, some are declarations, just different times in history where we started to develop kind of ethical guidelines for research and medical research. And in the bottom are kind of like famous or keystone examples of studies that just went wrong, very unethical, and what kind of guided the policies at the top. So I'm guessing out of all of the studies, this is the one that you may have heard of in passing or know about in a lot of detail. This is referred to as the Tuskegee Trials, often Tuskegee and Guatemalan syphilis studies. So it was this back in 1932 is when it started. So, and it was being investigated by the U.S. Public Health Service and in collaboration with the Tuskegee Institute, hence the name Tuskegee Trials. The objectives, they just wanted to learn more about syphilis. So they wanted to observe untreated syphilis, and they approached about 600 African-American men, and more than half of them had syphilis, and some did not. And there's a lot of ethical concerns with this one that you could probably read between the lines on, but probably the biggest one is that there was no information given to these participants, right? So they were being told that they're treated for bad blood. There was no informed consent. We'll get into what informed consent means, but basically they weren't really given any information about the study. And then they were, coerced by saying that you get free medical care, free meals, burial insurance was offered. And what was meant to be a 6-month study went on for 40 years. After the funding was kind of gone, The study continued, and probably the biggest ethical blunder here, and many of them, is that in 1947, so what's that, 15 years after it started, penicillin was found to be an effective cure for syphilis. And that was not followed up through with these participants. They were not offered treatment. So just a terrible example of human subject research here in the US, funded and ran by the US Public Health Service. This is kind of the main one that's referred to often, and you'll probably see it in Jeopardy questions or something like that. And then not long after that, I think everybody knows the kind of unethical behavior of the Nazi camps, but this is specific to research. So there was a lot of different research done in these Nazi camps by the German Nazi groups, and they were all on prisoners. There's a lot of different ones, and they're all pretty heinous. All the same issues from Tuskegee kind of transfer over, mainly that they don't have an option. They exposed people to mustard gas to try to understand and make a better effective burn treatment. They wanted to know how humans can handle different altitudes, so they would just put them in chambers to simulate altitudes, a lot of deaths. They were given malaria and treated with investigational drugs to try to establish drugs. The list goes on and on. So suffice it to say, it was just a terrible time for human subjects research, and there were just no guidelines at that point. So this is, again, 1941 to 1944. Then we skip to 1947, and because of the Nazi experiments, you've probably heard of the Nuremberg Trials, which were when the doctors that conducted these experiments were convicted of crimes within the concentration camps. And what came out of this was the Nuremberg Code, is what it's referred to, which is just a set of human subject research ethical principles that were considered permissible medical experiments. So this is kind of a list of them. They came up with 10 of them. A lot of these still exist today, and you probably recognize a lot of them, and most of them are basically basic decency. But this was a big point. I mean, this is the first time anything really came out like, hey, we need to have parameters for conducting research on humans, and they came up with this. So it's pretty landmark time. Again, this is in Germany at the time. And so around the same time, 1948, the World Medical Association started getting on board, right? So we're getting a little more movement here. Sorry, I skipped ahead here. And this is basically a committee appointed to prepare an oath or a promise for doctors, right? So this is related to the medical field, obviously, with the World Medical Association. And they came out with basically a for medical professionals when they get their doctorate degree to agree to several ethical and humanitarian goals. So this isn't specific to research, but it's very related, and the time frame is important. So you got your World Medical Association starting to develop at least some sort of oath for ethical treatment in a hospital setting or a medical setting. And around that exact same time, the United Nations, more specifically the World Medical Association, came out with the Declaration of Human Rights. So this was a pretty big deal because, again, it just started moving the thought that we need to establish standards here. And this came out as 30 different articles, and it really had a lot of significance moving forward. But at the time, we're still having a lot of unethical studies. So here in the US, the tea room trade study was happening in the 1960s. It was for a PhD dissertation. The idea was that this PhD student would go into public bathrooms and observe male homosexual behavior anonymously, and even follow people to their homes and interview them, acting as if they're like disguising themselves as not being a researcher and just being someone and interviewing them. The biggest ethical concern here, you see some trends, is there was no consent. There's a lot of deception going on. Clearly, like all these populations in these studies are vulnerable for different reasons. And around this time in 1964, there's still some movement here on ethical principles of research. So this is the World Medical Association again. At this point, they came out with the Declaration of Helsinki, which really was just kind of more specifically around research, and it had a lot of those same concepts that the Nuremberg and Geneva had. The significance here is that they came out with an actual written document for research ethics with the principles of respecting people with their rights and informed decisions. So not really specific, but just in general, having a little momentum here. And in the 70s, soon after that, we still have more examples of some unethical research here in the US. This one was called the San Antonio Contraceptive Study, where essentially they wanted to understand contraception, but they had a placebo group without telling people. So some people were given a placebo instead of contraception without knowing, and then they even switched it halfway. So everybody in this trial, which was 76 Hispanic women who were actually seeking contraceptives, at some point were not given what they were told. So obviously a lot of ethical issues with that. And the last one I'll bring up before we get way too depressed about it is the Willowbrook experiments. This is a lot of studies done within a mentally disabled children hospital. Clearly really vulnerable. They said they got informed consent, but which, with children is typically parental permission, but it was very uninformed and coercive because they were part of this hospital already. And in 1979, as we kind of finish up this kind of historical foundation, the Belmont Report was created. And you've probably heard of this before because this is still the cornerstone ethical report that we, IRBs, and really a lot of, the US research, but also globally go by. So we'll talk about this in a little more deep detail. But really the significance is it boils down ethical principles to three very fundamental ones that we'll talk about. And it still remains the principles behind the Department of Health and Human Services, the federal institution. And it really is what IRBs lean on to this day. The Belmont Report gets brought up in IRB board meetings and things like that. So that's kind of the background. So that's why we have IRBs, and that gives you a general idea of the timeline. And the one thing I'll point out is that that was not very long ago. And there's certainly, unethical research that happens now, but we've come a long ways in a short period of time. And it's right in our back door. It's not just Nazi camps or anything like that. So moving forward about what IRBs are like, the IRB mission, the composition of the IRB here. These are the three ethical principles that guide IRBs that are out of that Belmont report. The first one's what they refer to as respect for persons. And it basically is acknowledging and protecting autonomy, right? People should be able to make their own decisions about their own ability to be in research. Then there's this idea of beneficence, which seems pretty simple, but sometimes it's hard to gauge. And that's the idea of maximizing the benefit of research and reducing the risks wherever possible. Most research has some sort of risk, but it's maximizing benefit while reducing risks. And then the idea of justice, which is those who bear the burden should receive the benefit. As you saw in a lot of those situations, it was just different vulnerable populations that were a convenient way to do research unethically, rather than giving the benefit to the population that you're involving in research. So these three principles guide all of the IRB to this day, and a lot of federal policy. And speaking of federal policy, that's kind of what was developed out of these ethical principles. And the main one that a lot of IRBs do, and I consult with often, this is a regulatory foundation of IRBs, is the Department of Health and Human Services Common Rule is what it's called as. You hear it as the Common Rule. This is the biggest document in federal policy that guides IRBs to date. But there are other ones, right? We all know about the Food and Drug Administration. They have a different set of principles, related to foods and drugs, but are very similar to the Common Rule. Many of you, because we're a health campus, probably know very much or heard a lot about Hipaa, right? The privacy for medical studies in general. And then there are other regulatory foundations that the IRB goes off of, like we have a VA hospital here, and VA has a set of rules, Department of Defense. So there are different regulatory foundations that are all guided by those ethical principles, but are a lot more specific in our policy. But to make it a little more simple than all the policy is what does IRB do? Like I mentioned at the start, there's kind of two goals, right? So the main one is to protect the rights and welfare of human participants in research and make sure that none of those examples ever happen again or even close to. And then its second overall is like as an institution, right? An institutional review board as the University of Utah and our affiliated like hospitals. It's to oversee compliance with these different regulatory foundations. So the IRB is here to protect investigators and study teams and the institution along with humans, subjects, and research. So it's twofold. We're there for the researchers and for the research participants. This slide here is pulled out of the federal regulations, and so it's a little wordy, but it's really important. And when I get questions from students that have attended this in the past, this is the crux of what we talk about fairly often, and I'm always here to help understand this when you have research projects. But it's the idea of, okay, what does the IRB oversee? And it seems pretty simple, right? We oversee research that has humans. But when you get into the regulations, sometimes it's hard to define, right? So they define a human participant as a living individual for whom an investigator conducting research obtains data through an intervention or interaction, or they just have identifiable private information, right? So even if you're not interacting or intervening with someone, if you have identifiable private information, that's considered a human participant. And also I'll highlight that word living. The IRB's authority is over living individuals. So not to say that there aren't ethical principles for those who have passed or deceased, but the IRB's authority is over living individuals, private information, or interaction or intervention with humans. And then research, which sometimes is hard to define, right? And this is how they define it in federal regulations. It's a systematic investigation. So there's you can try to understand what systematic means. We have these discussions often. Is that study systematic enough to consider it an actual research study? Development, testing, evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge, right? So the standard here is you're doing a PhD dissertation and you want to publish it. You want that information to be generalizable. That's a good idea of a research project, but sometimes you just want to survey your class to see if they preferred a specific type of lecture or something. And that's not always considered a systematic investigation to contribute a generalizable knowledge and might not require IRB oversight. So this gives you an idea of the oversight authority and kind of the nuances of whether you need IRB approval for your study or not. But a good rule of thumb is if you're doing research and there's humans involved, you probably want to interact with IRB. If you're not sure if it falls inside the IRB's authority, you can always reach out to us and ask us through email or something. So the actual composition of the IRB, this is here at the University of Utah. There are many IRBs. A lot of institutions have it. All academic centers have their own institutional review board. A lot of hospitals have their own. So there's a lot of them here at the University of Utah as a research and hospital facility. There is a ton of research that happens here. This slide's outdated. We have way more than 7,000 active studies. It just seems to keep growing. We have over 100 IRB members. So IRB members are scientists, they're community members. There are a lot of professors. There's some rules on the different types of members that you need to create an IRB board, but there's over 100 of them. So we have a lot of volunteers, that help run the IRB. There's panels is what we call them, where they actually discuss studies at these panels. We have 7 of them. They happen every week, every Wednesday. We used to meet in person and have lunch and everything, but nowadays it's just online, which has been nice in some ways, and in some ways kind of not as nice. But so there's 7 panels. They meet every week. They talk about research studies every week, a lot of them every week. We have some panels that pop up from time to time that are not just on Wednesdays if needed. And our IRB here at the University of Utah is also the IRB for not only research that happens here at the university, student research, hospital research, all that, but we also are the IRB for the VA that I mentioned earlier. We're the IRB for Primary Children's Hospital, even though that's an Intermountain facility. They are a collaboration with the University of Utah. So we're the IRB for all research that happens at Primary Children's Hospital. And also there's the Shriners Hospital that we don't see a lot of research up there, but we are the IRB for some research that happens up at the Shriners Hospital up in the top of the avenues. So big operation, right? The composition of IRBs, it's a big thing. And this slide just gives you an idea that the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, although it is a large piece of a human research protection program, as we call it, the University of Utah has a larger system of human research protections. And so the IRB is one element of it, but there's also a HIPAA privacy office, right? We have a committee called the Conflict of Interest Committee. So that's an office that makes sure that anybody that's doing research, if they have a conflict, say they have stock in a drug company and they're doing research with them, that conflict is properly managed and communicated. We have a training, qualification, and resources element to this. There's a lot of ancillary reviews that we call them. So even though the IRB does general reviews of human subject research, depending on what type of study it is, there's different types of reviews that could happen. Like there's a radiation safety committee review, or the Primary Children's has their own review committee. And then along with all those regulatory and ethical principles that we've talked about to this point, there are also University of Utah standards and also Utah state laws that if research happens here, that the IRB and the whole human research protection program helps people navigate. So the things that come to mind is that Utah has very specific laws on who can act as a legally authorized representative that are different than other states, or institutional requirements where, we, as a good example is maybe, we have collegiate athletes that are considered a vulnerable population because they might be able to be coerced into different studies, where at a different institution, that's not something they think about. So other than those wide scoping ethical principles and regulatory foundations that come from a federal level, there's state and institutional ones as well that are part of this whole human research protection program. I always throw this slide in there because I've had questions about it. As I mentioned, institutional review boards, or human research protection programs, HRPPs is what we call them. They're institutional specific, but that doesn't mean the research is always just at one institution, right? There's a lot of collaboration. As an example, you may have a study that's happening here, but also with a different university or at Intermountain hospitals, and it's one research study that's happening at multiple institutions. It's important to know that the IRB, or the Human Research Protection Program, is really there for the investigator that's associated with that institution. So you, as a student at the University of Utah, myself and our IRB oversees the research that you do as a student. Even if you go out to the farmer's market to do your research, you're affiliated with the University of Utah, so we are your IRB. If you collaborate with someone from BYU or USU, they would go to their human research protection program to get approval for their activities. So it could be one study, it's related to the institution you're associated with. So that's kind of the whole composition of the IRB. It's a big operation, as you can tell, but there's also a lot of resources to help people navigate it. And so now I'll kind of give you an idea of what an IRB does, what it takes for an IRB to approve research. And the important thing here is that we don't expect researchers, and certainly students that are maybe doing their first research project, to ever know exactly everything that's required to get approval to do human subject research. So we help you through this process. So I just want to mention that when I pull up this slide, so it's not like, oh, was I supposed to consider all this? No, this is what the IRB considers and helps you navigate. And these are all tied back to those three basic ethical principles. So one of the things the IRB does is we ensure that the risks are minimized, right? So is the study design used with procedures that are, is it a good study design that is not, unnecessarily exposing subjects to risk? And tied to that, there's a common thing that comes up. We just have to, as an IRB, understand the ratio of risk to benefit, and is it reasonable, right? And you can imagine this makes for good conversation. You compare the risks of the research to the anticipated benefits for the participants specifically, but also to society as a whole, right? It might be that the participant doesn't really have a lot of benefit directly, but the risks of the study are reduced and the society benefit is large enough that it can be considered a reasonable ratio. So that's a big one that's talked about, at all these panel meetings. Equitable selection of subjects, right, or participants. So there are different populations, genders, age groups, non-English speaking participants. Are they being offered the research, mostly some of this research that offers some benefit to participants? Is it being offered equitably? Informed consent, is it being obtained? Is it needed, and is it being obtained? So this is a big one. We'll talk about this a bit because sometimes this is a hard one for new researchers to know exactly how to do informed consent. How do I write a consent document? So consent, it refers to an adult who gives consent to be in a research study. But there's also assent, which is children, right? So they're younger than 18 here in Utah, and that requires parental permission and assent. But we'll talk about that a little bit. But it must be sought from participants, right? That's one of the big things that came out of all of that historical foundation. We need to be informing people exactly what's happening in the study and let them make a informed decision. There are cases that the idea of consent is not reasonable for a study, and it doesn't mean research shouldn't happen. So there are times where a waiver of consent is granted by the IRB. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then the idea of consent also includes, is it documented, right? Do they have everything written, or at least in a form that they can digest it later or take it with them? Data is a big one. This is like an ongoing thing. As you know, the world is big data now, and monitoring safety for research participants has a lot to do with data protections now. So is it being monitored? Are there any unanticipated problems or things that could happen? And privacy and confidentiality go directly into that. So, and then lastly, vulnerable populations, are they protected? So the federal regulations lays out specific vulnerable populations that have different protections that they need, but just in general, are there safeguards in place to protect groups that are maybe more vulnerable to coercion or undue influence? And the example of collegiate athletes falls right into this. So these are kind of broad scope, but this is what the IRB considers, right? And so we've made it so that we can help you navigate this, but these are the general things that are required for a study to be approved before it can go forward with human subjects. So when assessing risk, really the IRB has two things. Is it minimal risk, or is it more than that? So this is how it's defined, and the board discusses this, and it's not always an easy line to draw, even though it's pretty straightforward concept. But is the probability or magnitude of harm or discomfort in the research not greater than what someone would encounter in daily life under routine physical psychological tests, right? So is it something that's not really greater than you'd expect in ordinary life, or is it more than that? So every study that comes to the IRB, it's either minimal risk or greater than minimal risk, and that gets determined by the board, or in some cases administratively. And so this is something to consider. I would say that the high percentage of undergraduate research is minimal risk. Greater than minimal risk most of the time are really high end, like hospital, drug trials, things like that. But certainly we see a lot of greater than minimal studies at an undergrad level too. But this really just dictates how the study's treated and kind of the protections in place. The risk-benefit ratio, like we talked about, one thing to point out here is that you evaluate the risks of the research specifically, not the risks of things around the research. So like, I don't know, driving to the University of Utah to be in the research study. The driving is not a risk of research. It's specifically the procedures in the research study. Are the benefits reasonable, and do they not pose long-term effects? And then what are the benefits to the participant society? We talked about that a little bit. So this slide illustrates the levels of a review. So if I back up a little bit, once we, we'll talk about the IRB applications, but once we feel like there's an application that's ready for the IRB to fully review, these are the types of reviews that it can go under. So the top bar here that shows non-human subject research, minimal risk. These are the risks we talked about. So non-human subject would mean that it didn't meet the definition of human subject in research that we talked about. Minimal risk we just talked about, and it can be a different review category if it's a minimal risk study. And then everything that's greater than minimal risk. These are the types of reviews we have. So you don't need to know these too much, but I think it's helpful. So obviously, if it doesn't meet the definition of human subject research, it doesn't need an IRB review. Sometimes we get these. We'll get an application, and we even have one specifically called Acknowledgement of Non-Human Subjects Review. And this is something the IRB can do and help you. If you feel like you're not sure if it needs IRB approval, we can provide you a statement that says that it doesn't. But there's no IRB review. And then if it's a minimal risk study that meets the definition of a human subject in research, it can be either exemption review, which really just means it's more administrative. It's still all the same ethical procedures, but it doesn't go to a full panel meeting of board members. Expedited review, which essentially means that, I wish they used different terms. These come from the federal regulations, but expedited doesn't just mean fast. It just means that it goes to one board member, right? So it might be a board member that's familiar with behavioral research or something that's relevant to that study, but instead of a full panel meeting, it just goes to one reviewer. And they may raise concerns or not. We have some minimal risk studies that go to the full board review. And those are typically, they're a little more rare. It's something that maybe minimal risk, but has a specific sensitivity. We have some, we've seen a lot of studies where they're doing research on like suicidal ideation or things like that, but the study might just be a survey. So there's not a whole lot of risk to it, but could there be? Well, we need board members that know more about this and community members that are part of that group to tell us. And so that's an example of something that may be minimal risk, but go to a full convened board review. And then anything greater than minimal risk goes to our full convened board. So this is kind of the level of review. This is not something that any investigator or student doing research has to determine themselves. The IRB does this for you. All you do is fill out an application. We do it for you. I would say that most research that happens is exempt or expedited, so which is a little easier for people because it doesn't go to the full board.
Can I just jump in and extra emphasize that last point that you made? Where your study will fall under kind of this spectrum is it's not up to you or even your mentors. You really do have to communicate with the IRB to have them tell you if it's exempt or doesn't count as human subjects research. If you make that decision yourself and you just start collecting data, you're going to run into some problems. So check with the IRB first.
Really good point. Yeah. And you feel free to email me too, if it's just a quick question about it or not. But yeah, we get it fairly often. An investigator will come to us and say, hey, my studies qualifies for exempt, so it should be fast or something. We're like, well, it may or may not. So and the terms are a little misleading too. I'll put it that because it says exemption review, which to me implies that it doesn't need a review, which it actually does. So anyway, let the IRB do this for you, or me, I can help you out. This slide's just kind of to pose a subject. Is ethical science good science, right? It is. So it doesn't happen very often because the idea of the IRB is to help people do quality ethical research. But sometimes a study is just literally not designed in a way that is worth putting anybody through any sort of risks, right? So good science is ethical science. That's one and the same. And so typically the IRB just helps people get their studies to a point that it's a good scientific. And at an academic center like the U of U, we don't see this a lot, but it's just ethical science is good science. So I'll talk about consent now a little bit, and I think it's helpful for you because this is a hurdle for some people when they're starting research. So this idea that you're doing research with a human subject and you need to get consent from them. You've probably been involved in research studies at some point and had some interaction with the consent process, as we call it. So that's the most important thing here, is that consent, getting permission from the participants to be in the research, is a process. It's not just a document. It's not just like the small print in an app that you download or something. It's supposed to be a full process, and the IRB helps develop that process to actually talk to someone about the research. But it also is a document, right? So it's a combination, and there are very clear guidelines on what the document needs to have. It's not being written for anybody. It's very specific to the study. And we have a ton of resources on this, but just keep that in mind. Getting consent is often a process and a documentation. There are situations where waivers, or that's what the IRB calls them, where we basically, the gold standard is you get full informed consent. There's a full document that has all the elements of consent in it. The participant is fully informed and has a discussion with an investigator, signs the document, agrees wholeheartedly to be in the study. That's the gold standard, but in many cases, studies don't either need that because the risk is so low, or there's justifiable reason not to have it. And in those cases, the IRB grants what we call waivers. So there's one specifically to the signature. You can waive the signature element of consent documentation, which we do all the time for like survey studies. Think of a study that you've maybe got online where there's a document at the start that says, hey, by taking the survey, you agree to be in this research. We see that all the time. So just keep that in mind, although the process is to have documentation and a full process for consent. Depending on your study, you may be able to have flexibility on that. And like I said, there's specific required elements of consent, and we have awesome resources for new researchers on writing a consent document or developing their process. And then there's always special considerations based on the study. Do you need a translator? Some of these more greater than minimal risk studies, you got to give participants time to talk to their family. These are big decisions. We have a lot of treatment trials where there's really no other medical treatment for some specific disease or condition, and this is their only option. And there's a lot of risks, and there's a lot of special considerations, and that's why it's a process. You can't just give someone a document. So we help you develop these in your own research studies and have a lot of resources on it. As I mentioned, there's vulnerable populations. These are the ones that are specifically brought up in the federal regulations. You can't have a list of every possible scenario, but children and neonates, I think that one's pretty straightforward. Children are particularly vulnerable. Fetuses, this used to be pregnant women and fetuses, but they've kind of, it's still considered that under federal regulations, but the real vulnerability is the fetus, right? The pregnant woman can make decisions for themselves. The fetus, cannot. And so that's considered a vulnerable population. Prisoners is almost like an obvious one, but research still needs to happen in prisons, right? So there's just a different set of regulations for it. People with impaired decisional capabilities, right? So the idea of getting consent from someone that is decisionally impaired is different, and there's unique situations for that. And then the socioeconomically disadvantaged, and we could add to this, and I'm sure you guys could come up with a lot of them. And so these are things to consider. These are the ones recognized federally that have very specific parameters on what can be approved. So I think the thing to get away from that is just think about when you're designing a research study, okay, who am I research? Like, what are the participants? Are they vulnerable for any reason? Another good example of this one that's institutional specific is if, students can be, if your teacher comes to you and says, hey, I've got this research study, if you do it, you get, a grade or something. There's specific situations like that come up, and the IRB has policies that say, you have to have an alternative for them to, they can be in the research study and get extra credit, but they've got to be able to have alternatives to get that same extra credit. So there's a lot of different situations on vulnerable populations to think about. Let's see, check the watch here. So for the last few minutes here, I'll talk about just the Irb resources. So that's a lot of information I gave to you. The Irb resources here, this is what I want you to take home, because it's where we can communicate later on when you get to the point of needing to interact with the Irb. This is just a list of like the type of research that, in parentheses, probably require Irb approval, because in some cases they might not. But this just gives you an idea of the breadth, right? So it can be a simple survey, interview, focus groups. We see a lot of those. Sometimes oral histories require Irb oversight. We have a lot of like retrospective chart reviews, right? So, or secondary data analysis, you could call it. So the data already exists somewhere, but it's identifiable human information. And so you want to go back and analyze that. That could require Irb approval. Some quality improvement situations or program evaluations require Irb approval. Sometimes they don't. And those are situations that I interact with students fairly often, trying to understand, okay, you're evaluating a program, let's figure out if it needs Irb approval or not. Public health initiatives sometimes are, we get exercise studies, and then we get a ton of randomized placebo-controlled drug clinical trials, that kind of thing. So it gives you an idea of the whole breadth of research that may need Irb approval. This is a big one. So the system that the University of Utah uses to navigate the entire human research protection process, right? So the Irb part of it, but everything else on that slide is all in one system that we call ERICA, the Electronic Research Integrity Compliance Administration System. It's a mouthful, so that's why we just call her ERICA. This is a smart platform, meaning that it's basically an application platform. You as a student have a UNID, so you can register through the University of Utah UNID system. And really it, because of all the different research that happens here, we rely on the system a lot to be a smart one that kind of, as you answer questions, it generates questions that are applicable to you only. And sometimes they're still not, but it's a smart system. It's a great resource. I've been at Irb long enough to know that this is pretty rare. Even other big academic centers have systems like this, but they're not quite as robust. So it might be a little clunky for some people, but it's because it has to encompass a lot of different research. So if a page isn't applicable to your research, it's likely that something probably wasn't answered right, and we help you navigate this process. Applications that require ancillary committees go through the same system. There's help text, there's links to guidance as you go throughout, and there's all correspondence is linked to your UNID, so it just sends through your email that's set up through your UNID, which is usually your email account. And then there's like an area to attach documents. So ERICA is the Irb Human Research Protection Program system. You can log in at any point because you're a U of U student, and I'd recommend it if you're ever getting to this point where you're developing a research study. You don't have to have your entire research study thought through all the way before accessing the system. You can go in there and start a fake study if you want. Until you hit submit, it just saves. So it's really helpful to dig in, and I'd recommend it if you're starting the process and just want to know what it takes. I'm not going to go into the slide a lot. It's really busy, but essentially the red boxes are the different pages in an application within that ERICA system. So there's an introduction. We ask about the locations, any sponsors. We ask about what are the participants you're interacting with. And then, it kind of extends from there based on your type of research study. Here's what happens. So let's say you have a research project, you've been working on it for a while, you've been in the ERICA system working on an application as you develop a consent process or whatever. Once you submit it, and this says PI, I should probably change that. So a PI is a principal investigator. That's the lead person doing the research. It can be anybody, it can be you, it can be a staff member. So when it says PI, it stands for principal investigator. That's what we call the lead of the study. A PI submits the application. So you can work on it forever. It stays in this creation phase. And once you submit it, that is not the end all be all, right? So you are not held to the standard of whatever you submitted, right? So we see a lot of applications that are really preliminary, and that's okay, because we have an IRB staff that does a pre-review, that we call it. And that's actually where I work primarily, is I help manage the staff that does pre-reviews of your ERICA applications. So once you submit it, it goes through a pre-review process. And that is where someone that's an expert at IRB applications, and they're just IRB staff, right? These are not the people that are going to ultimately review and approve your study. They're there to help you bring that application to a point where it can get a review from the IRB and ultimately approval. So they're there to help you. They send you revisions that say, hey, you maybe answer this question a little differently, or this doesn't apply. And the correspondence goes through the email, through the ERICA system. So there's some back and forth. Studies are never approved. They never get through the pre-review process without revisions. It just happens all the time. So don't be hesitant to hit that submit button, because that means we're going to work with you. But of course, you can reach out to us before you hit it too. Then after it gets through this back and forth with the principal investigator, you or a colleague of yours that you're working with, it gets a preliminary research assessment. So the IRB staff decides, hey, does this seem like a minimal risk study, or does it seem like a greater than minimal risk study? Because as I showed you before, that dictates the type of review it has. So sometimes it's in the gray area in between, and we have to help, have the IRB board decide. Most of the time we know whether it's minimal risk or not, or greater than minimal. And then it'll go to that next review, which is either the full convened board, or the expedited, or the exemption review, or we say, you know what, this doesn't even meet the definition of human subject research. You don't need our approval. You're good to go. Go ahead with your research. So it gets to that point. Sometimes the board will ask for even more clarification. Sometimes it'll just get approved right away. Our staff also does exemptions. So we might just exempt the project. And so that's the life cycle of it. Takeaway from this is it's here to help you through the process. So feel free to hit submit, even if you don't have a lot of confidence about it. I know when I submitted my first one, I was really nervous, and I shouldn't have been.
I want to jump in again and say it sounds and it feels really daunting, but I've been involved in several different IRB applications, and the pre-review is so helpful. Not only is Gary nice, but all of the staff that are going to do the pre-review and have those email communications with you, they're so wonderful. And so, yeah, it feels weird and you feel really nervous. And when you get a suggestion for revisions, it kind of feels like, oh, I have to do more work, or I did something wrong. But it is so helpful. And our studies have always ended up better for this email communication with the IRB staff that we've talked to. So yeah, it's a good thing.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. So yeah, it's not a slap of the hand. You do better. It's a let's help you get through it a little bit, because there's just a lot to consider. I think there's a lot in this presentation, so they're here to help. And again, their staff, they're just like you guys. They're like any of us associated with the U of U. They're not here to get anybody in trouble. We're trying to help out. I'm going to give you an idea of the timelines, and probably the biggest thing to take away from this is, if you think you need to interact with the IRB with a research study, just get a hold of us as soon as possible, because it's just going to help. But once you hit that submit button on the application, obviously the review time can vary, because there might be more back and forth. With some studies, exemption review studies go a lot faster because they don't need to be assigned to a board meeting. But generally, we get a pre-review report back to you within 2 weeks. We're trying to make that faster, but I would say within 2 weeks, you'll get a response. And then once we get the application up to standards, it takes about another week to process it. So this varies a lot. This slide says continuing reviews. Some studies have an expiration date where the IRB says, hey, you need to come back to us in a year and tell us the progress. So that's a specific application type. And then there are always amendments. You always design a study and then at some point need to change it a little bit, right? So you can submit an amendment to the IRB saying, hey, we're changing our protocol. We're going to enroll more people, or we're going to add a new survey, or we're going to change our survey questions. That happens all the time. It's an amendment application. That goes a little faster, but it's still around that 2 weeks before we get back to you the first time. So interact with us sooner than later, and it will help you. Hope that the IRB is not a bottleneck to getting your study done or getting your publication or paper written before your class is over or something. So that's kind of the end of the presentation here. I want to shout out to our website. It has a ton of information on it, and probably the most helpful for new researchers is the consent and document templates. There's a lot of templates. There's a lot of guidance documents, a lot of walkthroughs. So, and again, interact with the Erica online system at will. There's a lot of help text in there, and you can work on it and never submit something. So just use that system to your benefit. Consult with IRB. We are people. I'm available to answer emails. I love when I hear from students that were part of this program because it means that we're communicating with you and interacting. So it's good. And then there's, I think they changed the name of this. This says additional RATS classes. It used to be Research Administration Training Series. I think they changed the name of that. I need to update this. But basically, there's a whole, oh, there you go. RED, I think that's what it's called. I'll make something like that. Thank you. There's a whole department on research education that offers a lot of online classes and stuff. They're revamping a lot lately because I know that because the IRB has classes on there. And it's a great resource. So ton of resources here. Sometimes almost too many to know how to navigate. So just reach out to us or Shiver to help navigate these resources. Here's the general email and stuff, but this is being recorded, and I think you have my information. So